They killed the boy.
Hey, welcome back, ScreenCrush. I'm Rhaenyra, and House of the Dragon Season 2 premiere just had the most heartbreaking moment in Game of Thrones ever. In fact, I think that end scene highlights a feature of this show that was missing in the original series. And it makes me wonder, so far, is House of the Dragon actually better than Game of Thrones was at this point? A little later, I'm going to talk to Rachel Leishman and our own Brianna McLarty about this, but first, let me explain what I mean. Now, we have seen brutal deaths in Game of Thrones before. The Red Wedding, the Viper in the Mountain, and all of our expectations for the final season.
You are my queen, now and always.
But most of these tragic deaths in the original series were adults who willingly walked into war. These were grown people who made choices. Robb chose not to honor the marriage pact of the Freys. Ned chose to warn Cersei, etc. So in a way, they all deserved what was coming to them. But Helaena is one of the few true innocents in this story. She was basically born into this palace, never had a say in her marriage, and then had to suffer a mother's ultimate agony. She and her children were true innocents. Now, it is interesting though how they changed this from the book, which I'll ask Brianna about in a little bit. See, the book is written from like third-hand accounts, so it has inaccurate details. In the book, it says that the assassin made Helaena choose which child to kill. But here we see that's not quite the truth. But that is how Helaena would have remembered it, because she would have never actually understood what the hell was happening to her. Now we see something similar with Aemond. In the book, it makes it seem like he murdered Luke for fun. But in the show, we see that he was actually surprised and kind of horrified by what happened. But see, Aemond would have never admitted that he lost control of Vhagar because it would have made him look weak. So that's how the story grew that he killed him on purpose. You see, Aemond's entire life is centered around the moment when his brother and nephews laughed at him for not having a dragon.
They gave me a pig!
A what? They said they found a dragon for me, but it was a pig.
Everything he has done since then is just a way to protect that little boy from being embarrassed. And this is what makes this show work so well. We really know these characters. We saw their childhoods. We know their secrets. We see what makes them choose to do awful things. Nearly everyone on this show is sympathetic in some way. I mean, Game of Thrones had great villains, Joffrey, Ramsay Bolton, who were just flat out evil. But in this show, we get to see the origins of every character. We're watching this great house slowly fall apart because of childhood drama and petty misunderstandings, and it's just heartbreaking. Game of Thrones was never really able to deliver on that level of backstory. Now look, yes, this show does have a clear-cut villain, the Greens, and like we mostly root for the Blacks. And that's also why we designed these new opposing dragon sports tees, Team Green and Team Black, available at our merch store right now. Guys, shopping our merch store is the best way to support our channel. We have lots of other parody merch satirizing Star Wars, Marvel, The Boys, and more. The links are below. So even though we all root against the Greens, we understand them. Like, okay, let's compare two villainous members of the Kingsguard, Criston Cole and Jaime Lannister. With Sir Criston, we see that he started off as a man of pure intention, who was embarrassed, and then this slowly led him down a path to better revenge. But with Jaime, that character journey took several seasons to reveal, and I feel so sorry for poor, stupid, incredibly stupid Alicent.
Yeah, she really is kind of an idiot.
Yes, but she is a pious idiot who is only doing what she actually thinks is right. She has been a prisoner in this castle for years, and she is just trying to perform as she is expected to. I don't blame her for being jealous of Rhaenyra, even if she can't bring herself to admit that that's the reason she resents her stepdaughter. But that is just one example of how this series is showing us how small character motivations on a personal level can explode into these horrific acts that just spew bloodshed to the common people. And speaking of the common people, Brianna McLarty, you wrote our Easter egg video. You did a great job on it. It's up on the channel right now. You also had this interesting thought about the scene where people were like petitioning Aegon for aid, where you talked about, you thought that that was kind of a nice thing. I was curious if you wanted to elaborate on that, because that's not the impression I got from the episode.
Well, I don't think Aegon is necessarily a good person by any means. Obviously, we see him, especially in the small council, being terrible. I just was expecting someone more along the lines of like Joffrey, who is incredibly vicious to his own people. He's vicious to everyone, but very vicious to his own people. And Aegon actually being like, oh, well, we'll give you your sheep back, even if he doesn't do it, or even just being willing to pay for the scorpion up front and saying the small people will help win this war. I thought it was a lot nicer than they could have made him. And I think one of the complaints I saw about last season was that there was like no reason really to root for the Greens. And so I was glad at least they didn't make him completely vicious and completely awful. And they made him, he's stupid, but like they at least didn't make him just like a terrible like asshole. they kind of made him try to do things nice for the little people, even if he didn't really always hit the mark.
You bring up a good point there. And by the way, Brianna, where can people find your social links? Where are you at?
You can find me on Instagram at Brianna T. McClarty, and you can also find me on TikTok at Brianna T. McClarty.
Awesome. Links for those are below. So you bring up an interesting point that I kind of want to hear Rachel elaborate on. The book, right? And Rachel, I'm not sure if you've read the book. Have you?
No, I just know it's a history book.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's a history book. So the book does a lot of, it'll say things like the people cheered Aegon in part because he was a man. I think this episode in that scene showed maybe why there's a perception of that, because Aegon was saying, oh yeah, we want to help out the small folk and things like that. And we're getting various things like that where you can see how events were misinterpreted. For instance, Rachel, this scene at the end. So I was said earlier, I think that is the most brutal scene I've ever seen in Game of Thrones because it dealt with an innocent life. Scenes like that make me think, gee, could this show actually surpass the original Game of Thrones? So where do you stand on that? Like, what was your reaction from that scene? And do you think it compares to anything we saw in the original series?
I think it compares to the Red Wedding 100% because we watched Robb Stark's unborn child get killed. So it's like, that is the closest comparison in the original show. It would just be the Red Wedding. But, I thought it was the part that was the hardest to kind of watch was making Helena choose and sit there and pick the child and tell them. I understand that it's like she was there and like those two guys were just trying to do what they thought was right. But I thought it was just like that part was what was the most vicious. Not like I've seen multiple people get murdered in horrible ways on Game of Thrones. But it was the mother having to pick and show them what child was
and somehow the sound of the child being killed was worse than actually seeing it. That was awful. Rachel, you of course, you're assistant editor at the Mary Sue, right? And where can people find your social links?
On Twitter, I'm at Rachel Leishman, and then on Instagram and TikTok, I'm Rachel_Leishman.
Right. So all those links again are below. So again, though, I look at the Red Wedding and I'm like, okay, yes, the unborn child was killed, but the adults in that scene chose their path. And one thing we're seeing in this show is that very few of the adults, especially the women, actually ever feel like they have a choice, right? Earlier, I talked about Aemond and how Aemond is completely, it's like, the child is the father of the man. He is entirely shaped by his childhood embarrassment, childhood trauma. He's the second son, like Otto, who's always trying to prove himself. That's why I think when I look at this show, I'm like, I never felt that much immediate empathy for any character, right? Like even with Tyrion Lannister, we learned that he was married to a prostitute eventually. We learned all these other stories about his backstory, but for the most part, that throws you in the middle of the story and then you have to catch up. Brianna, do you think this has been like a huge asset for this show so far? Like the fact that, like, how much sympathy are you feeling for all these characters?
I think it's been an asset in a lot of ways because I do feel a lot more sympathy, even for Rhaenys, which is she's kind of more of a side character. But I feel a lot more sympathy for these characters. On kind of the flip, like the reverse of that is I feel like characters I may have liked better if I didn't know their backstory is like Alicent. Like I don't like them as much
because I was saying this earlier, but I feel so bad for Alicent all the time. She's just an idiot.
I feel terrible for Alicent's childhood, and I feel terrible that her like father essentially like pimped her out, and I felt really bad for her like through the entire like first half of the first season. When she kind of became like a religious fanatic, maybe because I grew up in a kind of religious environment, I was like, whoa. But especially this season, where she's such a hypocrite, that's been like really hard for me. I really dislike Sir Kristen Cole, which doesn't help anything, admittedly. Sure. But like, I think just seeing like how much of a hypocrite she is, and the fact that she kind of like she turned her back on Rhaenyra because she slept with Sir Kristen Cole.
15. I mean,
she kept
like that. Like they were basically in youth group together,
Yeah, but she was angry at her through all of the last season too, when they were like adults.
True, and that's also though because of her dad. Her dad told her when she was young, like, Rhaenyra will kill your children. So the men in these women's lives have just instilled so much irrational fear in them, and they've worked them up to the point where, well, Alicent especially, maybe not Rhaenyra, they've worked her up to a point where she would basically be a weapon they could guide at any point. And by the way, I know, you said, you wrote in our Easter egg video that she was a hypocrite for hooking up with Sir Criston Cole. I was actually really happy for her, because this woman had to like do her duty with Viserys for a really long time.
Yeah.
I'm happy she's finally found some amount of physical pleasure.
I'll be honest, if she was just sleeping with someone, I'd probably be fine with it. Maybe it's because I really dislike Sir Criston Cole for holding a grudge against Rhaenyra, who he chose to sleep with for a long time. So it's part of that.
Total
I just maybe really hate him.
But even him, Rachel, you have to admit, even with him, you do see the building blocks of how he becomes the person he is, right?
Yeah.
So where are you at on this Alicent thing, Rachel? Are you team green, team black? Do you feel sympathy for her, or do you want to see her consumed in flames?
I'm team black. I was so mad that like in the videos, New York had team green banners on like I was like, no, absolutely not. Like this is a team black zone. Rhaenyra is the queen, and she should be. But like Alicent, the thing that makes me very sad is that a lot of the times it's all about Alicent being trapped in that marriage with Viserys, and then Alicent's kids now ruling, and she kind of just is like there and doesn't know anything. But what makes me sad about both Rhaenyra and Alicent is that these two characters were best friends, and I think a lot of the time in the grand scheme of like everything else that's going on, that gets forgotten, because it's like, oh well, Rhaenyra is against her half brother. It's like, no, Rhaenyra is against her best friend, and the two of them aren't talking, and that is very sad to me. But yeah, no, team black. Half the time when they go to check in on team green, I'm like, okay.
But yes, we're obviously supposed to root for team black, right? I root for team black. What I'm saying though is that I think that the Greens have gotten a lot more character shading than, say, the Lannisters or the Boltons or any of these, or the Masters of Slaver's Bay, people like that, right? That's one thing I really think where this show is starting to surpass the original. Part of it's because we actually saw their backstory, saw their childhoods, whereas, we didn't see Robert's rebellion, and nor should we have. So I don't know. I kind of look at it like, especially with Alicent, right? Because I have known people like in my family who are trapped in a similar situation where you're a young kid, you have this happens every day and has for centuries. Young women just don't have any other option, and they're basically given to a man, and they're forced to live in that country house and bake for him and his kids. This happens all the time. So for me, I feel a lot of sympathy toward her. Again, Brianna, you're right. She makes decisions as an adult that are deplorable, but even then, we go like to what really started this, which is her misunderstanding Viserys's last words and internalizing them and making them about her and her son, her Aegon, right? And you can just look at this entire show and say, this just sucks. This is just unfortunate. This is just a series of misunderstandings. And like you said, I don't want to see these two women fight. I want them to be like, all Rhaenyra ever wanted was to fly around with her best friend on her dragon and have adventures. And it's just a tragedy. And Game of Thrones never got me on quite that very deep human level.
I'll say one of my favorite things about this show is also like, you have characters like Aegon, you have characters like Aemon, and like I don't hate them in the same way I hated Joffrey. Like I don't want to watch them die. I wanted to watch Joffrey die. I was like, I can't wait till this guy is dead. Like I hate him. Where it's like, I understand where Aemon's coming from and a lot of the things that Aemon does. I understand where Aegon's coming from. I don't agree with them, but I understand their thought process. And maybe it is because we got to see them when they were younger and know what happened to them. And so, but I don't think that would have helped with Joffrey anyway. But like I at least see where they all came from, and I understand why they're this way. And it makes like, I think Aemon sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm really interested in what he's up to. And in Game of Thrones, anytime it was a character I disliked, I was like, get this away from me. I don't.
You can also look at Rhaenyra and Alicent, right, as mothers, because this is truly a show about motherhood and about what's expected of mothers in the Seven Kingdoms. And Rhaenyra is just a much better mom than Alicent. And I think that all stems from, her children were born out of love and Alicent's were born out of duty. And Alicent, anytime her kids don't perform to expectations, she gets angry and bitter at them because I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do. How come you can't? Again, it's just a very human thing that I think happens in every household in America. So shifting back to the rest of the episode, though, One thing also, Brianna, that I really appreciated was that, that ending look that Rhaenyra had at the end of season 1, you thought, okay, it's on, like we're going to go. But in this episode, we see that she still needs that time to stop and that time to grieve. Where were your thoughts on like Rhaenyra's journey in this, and where do you expect her to go for the rest of the season emotionally? I know where she's going to go story-wise, but what we didn't get in the book is the internal, the emotions of what drives her.
Yeah,
without spoiling the book too.
Yeah. I think with her, I really actually love seeing that grieving process. I also think it does a really good parallel with the mothers and the men in their lives, because anytime the mothers have like a modicum of empathy or like human like sadness, the men in their life are immediately like, well, that's weakness, that's awful. So I really did like that.
Damon especially. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah. And so I think with her, I think she's going to hate Aemond. Like, I just think she's going to hate him. And I don't totally blame her for that, because in the same way that, Alicent is not going to know that they didn't mean to kill the little boy, it was supposed to be Aemond.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't know Aemond didn't really mean to kill Jacaerys, because like,
but also if Aemond hadn't made the toast either, none of this would have happened. Sorry, I cut you off. Please continue.
No, exactly. Aemond, he's such a troublemaker. He is such a troublemaker.
What a scamp. What a mischievous,
what a little
sapphire-eyed scamp. Yeah. No, I cut you off though. Please continue.
I think with her, we're gonna, probably see, she's not going to want everyone to die. Like Alicent also doesn't want everyone to die. I do think she's going to want Aemond to die, and I think her vengefulness against Aemond is going to probably take her to some very extreme places that's going to cause other people to die. But I think with her, we're just starting to see like genuine like revenge and just like hatefulness that we haven't seen as much with her character at all in like the previous season. Like we saw her get angry, but Alicent was really the one who like had more like hate in her heart, and I think that's going to change now.
Interesting. Rachel, you've seen all of the original series, right? Many times, like the rest of us. Okay, great. So it's unfair to compare House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones. Which one's better? Because obviously Game of Thrones had the books to adapt for the first 5 seasons, and then did its own thing in the next 3 seasons. Like that's a whole other conversation. I do think it's fair though to step back and compare season 1 and episode 1 of season 2 with what we've seen in House of the Dragon so far. Do you feel like this way of storytelling, starting with the Grand Council and the childhood, do you think that the original series would have benefited from that? Like in the apples and oranges, are you preferring just the raw storytelling of season 1 versus season 1 of House of the Dragon?
I think I like season 1 of Game of Thrones better, just because I do think they rushed a lot of season 1 of House of the Dragon. Like, if we could have spent all of that time with Rhaenyra and Alicent when they were girls and like had that be the season, I think I would have felt very differently. But because we spanned like 3 decades in a season, it felt just kind of like, I don't remember like 20% of this. But then when something happens in season 2, I'm like, oh, right, that happened in season 1. And I think Game of Thrones not having, all right, we're doing 30 years in one season, and then you have to remember all of that for in the future, helped us like slowly build an appreciation for these characters. Like, didn't like Jaime for most of the show, and then later in the series was like, oh, Jaime Lannister rules though. And like it took me building that, where this show was like, yes, I loved young Rhaenyra, I still love Rhaenyra now, but I wish I had got a lot more time with young Rhaenyra so I could see all those little nuances between her and Alicent. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and I love the Jaime Lannister comparison. Earlier, I talked about him and Kristen Cole and how, because they're 2 members of the King's Guard who, have similar arcs. They both start off, I think Jaime did join the King's Guard originally out of a desire to help with his vows, but also to be close to his sister, right? But either way, his motivations were pure at the beginning when he killed the Mad King, and then he bought this own narrative of himself. Kristen Cole did the same thing. He started with pure intentions and then bought into his own narrative that he was more pious and pure and good, when, Brianna, you'd be the first person to point out, pretty hypocritical dude. But I get everything you're saying, Rachel, and we did a whole video about how I thought the first season was rushed. But again, it was happening during peacetime. I mean, I guess they could have like given us some action scenes in Dorne and things like that. But for the most part, I don't know, maybe they were also just wanting to get to the meat of the bone a little bit faster. Brianna, where are you at on that? Do you think that this show so far is like surpassing or can surpass GOT?
I feel like it's such a hard question because I just think they're fundamentally very different shows. I probably prefer House of the Dragon a little bit more because I find it as a show a little bit more accessible because it is really just about like these two families. And that's kind of all you have to remember versus I do feel like GOT is like a little bit, especially if you didn't start watching when it like first came out, it's kind of difficult to get into because there's like the whole first season is like new family, plot, new place. It's very big. I just think they're very different stories. So I think it kind of depends on your personal preference. Like, do you want a big sprawling story that covers like legitimately an entire kingdom, or do you want like a more personal story that is really about just fundamentally about two people? I probably prefer House of Dragons. I do think it's a little rushed, but the first season of Game of Thrones, even like rewatching it, I was like, oh my God, there is so much happening right now.
Yeah, and if I have a criticism that I hope of season 1, apart from, it would have been nice to have lingered a bit longer, like Rachel said, it is that we didn't see a lot of what's happening elsewhere in the kingdom, but frankly, a lot of it didn't matter yet. Like, we could have, say, checked in with some characters who are going to be important this season, but it didn't matter. One thing I really want this season that I really hope we get is that expansion into the rest of Westeros. And Rachel, this is where I'm going to bring the Starks into it, right? So we start this episode with something very interesting. So we see Cregan Stark. He starts off telling Jace about their duty on the wall. And in 180 years' time, that duty's been forgotten by Ned. Like, they just think that the White Walkers are a rumor and a fairy tale, and they've been long gone. So I thought that was interesting. And in the book, I don't want to spoil anything, it shows his journey north. Like, he goes to River Run and the Erie, and he makes all these different overtures to people that are successful. And there's other characters like there's a girl named Snow in the north who is hinted at as being really important. And I hope that we still get that. Like, I really hope that we see him go back to the north or make another appeal to Cregan Stark. Because if the show stays focused on Dragonstone and King's Landing, I think that it's doing a disservice to the story. Rachel, did you feel like everything was too insular in this? Do you need to see more of the continent?
Yeah, the Starks are my favorite, so I need to go back to Winterfell like right now. I was a Robb Stark girl, and I knew going in what that entailed, and then I loved Oberyn. So when you said Dorne, I was like, yeah, I wish we would go to Dorne.
Yeah, I mean, you have your Pedro Pascal podcast, right?
Yeah, I was like, I wish we would go to Dorne, and I love the Starks. So I really liked going to Winterfell. I do love that all of the Starks still sound like Kit Harington. Like, I think it's very funny that the Winterfell accent is what Kit Harington was doing.
Yeah, they sound like they're from Newcastle.
Yeah, they're just all like,
but
I'm Jon Snow. I'm like,
well, so what did you think about the Night's Watch actually operating as they should and taking people from each house and it actually being a sacred thing? Like, to my knowledge, George R.R. Martin has never spelled out the decline of the Night's Watch. I thought that was so interesting, especially when you couple it with the revelation that the reason Aegon conquered the Seven Kingdoms was to fight the Night King, right? That's why he did it. And we're kind of seeing, I think that by the end of the series, that purpose is going to be forgotten, which is why the dragons are going to die out. So what did you think about that revelation that the Night's Watch is actually a functional group that's doing its job?
I love it. It's kind of the opposite of like how the Acolyte is showing us that, like, hey, the Jedi have never been that great even when they were at their highest. I like that this is like
controversial.
Sorry. But it's like, no, but the Night Watch, they kind of functioned and did what they were supposed to at one point in their lives. And I think it's very fun and interesting. And I do hope that Jace goes back there. Like, I know why he went home, but I'm like, go back.
I think he'll go back. I think because he did just promise, the Starks just promised some graybeards. And I think that they're going to need warriors for what's coming. And especially, I don't know. It's interesting, though, because when word gets out of Blood and Cheese, which we've barely talked about, when word gets out in the book, it's very much, it's not framed that, oh, they were trying to kill Aemond. It was just son for a son. So the book gives us an interpretation of events, right? That Aemond killed Luke just out of revenge, but really it was an accident. He couldn't control his dragon, like I talked about earlier. With Blood and Cheese, it's going to test, it's like the Empire using the Death Star on Alderaan. That, if anything's going to push the Starks away from Rhaenyra, it's going to be that. But they're, like you said, are going to honor their oaths. Brianna, what about you? How do you see the repercussions of blood and cheese kind of echoing? I mean, hell, not just throughout the show, but throughout pop culture. It's a rough scene, man.
God, it was so
hard.
brutal. And I knew it was like, because I've read the book, I knew it was coming, and I still was like, oh my God, that is awful. I think there's definitely going to be a lot of repercussions. I think Rhaenyra is going to be really mad about that, to be perfectly honest. Yeah. I think Damon's also going to be mad, but I think Rhaenyra is going to be like super angry. I think we'll also probably see that like with Rhaenys to some extent. Because I just don't think either of those people were like, yeah, let's go kill like a literal like 3-year-old or however.
Yeah, no one's up for infanticide.
Yeah,
but I think here's the other thing too. If we're going to show this show, the show's is not trying to show us Team Green, Team Black. Who do you root for? Which side do you choose? It is very clear that the High Towers are the bad guys and the Blacks are the good guys. I do wonder if the show took liberties with this. If they said, well, we can't have our hero kill a baby, so let's make it an accident. That might have happened. And I want to confess something. This is terrible, but for our merch store, we do parody merch. And I've read the book and I thought, oh, it'd be hilarious if we did a blood and cheese daycare shirt with like a cartoon mouse and a cartoon cheese. And I watched the scene and I was like, oh, what was I thinking? That was just the most horrendous, like, stop the presses, don't make that shirt, we can't put that out. Like, we never got past the idea stage on it, but oof, that would have just canceled everybody associated with the channel so fast because it's done so well. Like, you really hate that guy and you hate to see these events happen. And Rachel, wouldn't you agree that like knowing this backstory and these characters and you just really feel for them in a way that, I never felt for Oberyn and Martell's sister. You hear their fate described. It sounds terrible, but it's relying on an actor to sell that story. Here, we're not relying on an actor to sell the story. We're relying on the actor, the scene design, the music, the editing. And it's just, I love this handhold through this entire tragedy.
Yeah, what I'll say is, like, you used Oberyn and his sister, for example. What worked in that is I wasn't like, oh my God, this sister. I felt bad for him, where this is like, I feel bad for this situation. And it's like a different kind of feeling. I am a Daemon apologist. I love Daemon Targaryen. And so when I watch these guys fully misunderstand, I don't think Daemon would be like, yeah, go kill that 3-year-old. As you guys said, I think it was I want you to kill Aemond. And if not, there's a bunch of, like, there's other brothers you could have tried, not this child. And so I think seeing that and like how that went down, I don't think it's going to go over well on either side. But it is very interesting that in the book, you guys said it was a son for a son, how it was described. And I was like, that sounds like some Team Green history rewriting.
Some propaganda, yeah.
I was like, that sounds like some history writing, because that is not necessarily like, yes, sure, that was the mindset that Daemon went in with, but it was more specifically just get Aemond back.
Right. Brianna, we don't have much time, but I didn't really get to hear what you had to say about the Night's Watch, and especially the fact that they believe for thousands of years, they have believed in the White Walkers. I think part of that reason might be because in living memory, the dragons refuse to fly over the wall, which you talked about in your Easter egg video. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like why you think there's this mystical connection between the dragons, the White Walkers, and maybe how when the dragons were gone, the belief in do you think this is all connected?
I definitely think it is all connected. I'm not going to pretend that like I know the exact intricacies of how dragons work, but I do feel like they probably have a sense for danger a lot. Like most animals have some sense of danger where they'll just like see that something is wrong. And we also know that dragons just in general don't like being in the cold. So I have a feeling they probably had just like a sixth sense of being like, no, I should not like go past this wall. Like there's something bad there. And I definitely think that is part of it. But I also would say even in Game of Thrones, we see it where every once in a while, there'll just be like a White Walker. And they're like, what? We thought these were dead. And even Cregan Stark doesn't say why they manned the wall. Like if you know a series like, we didn't build a big wall for wildlings. And Jace is like, well, why'd you build it? And then he just goes quiet. because the
I thought
rest
he-
of the
the-
world still doesn't believe it.
Oh, right. I thought he said death, but yeah, you're right. And rewatching that first season too, I'm like, why did they keep this secret? The whole there's death coming from the north. I guess they had their reasons, but I was like, if they just would have told a few more people about this, I think they would have been a little bit better prepared years later. And I love your description, by the way. The dragons just don't like the cold. Like a dragon is like a cat that you try to let out in the winter, and it goes, "Oh no, chilly."
Well, it does say in the book, they say about Jace's dragon, which I thought was really funny. They're like, he couldn't stay in the north long because his dragon didn't like the cold. He had to leave.
Yeah. And I am curious, very, very, very minor spoilers from the book. The book has all sorts of rumors in it, right? Like that Luke survived his fall and got amnesia and became a fisherman, or that Jace's dragon laid a clutch of dragon eggs at the wall, things like that. I'm curious. There's a few characters who are referenced in this scene, this part of the story that we haven't seen yet. Like there's a bastard girl in the north who's very interesting. I'm curious to see what was true, what wasn't, and what they just decide, hell, that sounds fun. Let's go with that. So I'm really, like I said, guys, up for this show so far. I think it's just incredible. So Rachel, Brianna, thanks again for joining me. You can find their social links below. And I just want to hear from you guys now. Let us know your thoughts on this episode down in the comments or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Rhaenyra.